You want to?
You're good?
Yeah, I think we're good to kick off.
Let's do it.
All right. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out, especially early. I know we're kind of the first talk here, so we really appreciate you guys coming in. This is Bootstrapping Your Game, turning your passion to a real-life game and business. My name is Harold.
I'm Eric.
And we'll be talking today about, from my end, putting together a tabletop card game, and Eric, a full digital experience, and we'll be hopefully sharing our experience with you guys. And I'm certain there are folks here that are in that space as well, and we're hoping, especially with the QA, that it's really kind of a conversation and just kind of a knowledge share. So hopefully, kind of helps everyone out. So in trying to break this down today, part one, introductions, which you are all privy to right now, we're in the middle of. So we broke down our process. In talking to Eric, there was a lot of similarities, even though our games are very different, that we found in the process. So we broken the talk down to 4 different phases, and we'll go through each one of those. And then at the end, as I mentioned, we want to leave time for Q&A, and we're seeing that as sort of an essential, important part of the talk.
So hopefully when we're talking through the 4 phases, if you're currently working on a project, one of these phases are going to kind of resonate with you, and if that's the case and you have concerns about where you're stuck or how to move to the next phase, that's really what that Q&A portion is all about. So hopefully we can kind of workshop that at the end of the talk.
Okay, so my name is Harold Sipe. I am one half of Small Monsters Games. It's a small, we focus on card and board games that really look to translate life experience or bits of memoir into relatable, engaging, easy to learn, fun to play tabletop experiences. My wife is second half of Small Monsters Games. Unfortunately, although she was slated to speak, she's not able to be here today, so unfortunately I'm what you guys have to put up with. So go ahead.
My name is Eric Peterson. I'm co-founder of GrappleHook Games. To give you kind of some context about myself, I graduated from Northeastern University in 2015 with a degree in comp sci and game design. While I was at Northeastern, I co-founded GrappleHook with my friend Adam Gresson after we made Squad Hero Revolver. Squad Hero was a really fun project for us. It won some awards locally. It was small and never got a proper release, but that was kind of our first title. We're now working on Sorcery, which I'll be kind of talking about today. And that title came from a class project at Northeastern, so that experience was all pretty important to kind of how I got to where I was.
Okay, so as I mentioned, we've broken this down into 4 phases of development, and Eric touched on, again, this is, I really think there's kind of something anyone who's gone through either making a game or created a project has probably touched on, some part of our sort of common findings. So we're really looking forward to kind of digging into that, discussing that.
Yeah, so let's get started with phase 1. Turning a thought into a thing. So the idea for this part is just the initial kernel of whatever your project is. This is how you get from, I think I might have an idea about a game, and what are the first steps you should be taking in order to kind of make progress and get to where you want to go.
I mean, for Meg and I both come from the video game industry. We worked on Casual Game. It's actually how we met years ago, working on a number of games together. So when our situation was we were technically out of the industry. I'm working in tech. She's now working as a teacher. But we still kind of had that love and commitment to games. And really, just as we thought about coming back to that space, of course, we had hundreds of ideas or notions or things we wanted to do, maybe when we were in the industry that we never had an opportunity. So it was really hard to kind of nail that down. I mean, when you kind of, I think, anyone that's creative, they're constantly, it's just kind of rushing through your head, and how do you pick the one thing out of the hundreds of things that present itself to say, okay, I'll put investment in that, or that's what I'll kind of pursue. And for us, my background, Meg is a game designer. I I'm the graphic designer, artist, but I'm also a producer, and that's a lot of what I did. Well, it's pretty much all I did in the video game industry. So it's kind of where those two tracks kind of met. So our title that we released last year is Take Out the Card Game. It's a set collection game. You're trying to build a meal of Chinese food with all the flavors before your players. So when we looked at this idea, or when Meg kind of like thought up, like, hey, I would like to, like, she lived in China for years, she taught in China for years, and it really kind of meant a lot to her, and you know, she still teaches languages and really enjoys like that space, and it's really kind of core to who she is. So that was an experience that seemed like, hey, you know, that there's a passion there that we'd want to build on, or we would want to talk about that or convey that, or figure out how we could take that and translate it into a playable experience we could share. So once the passion was kind of there, it was really, you know, our first step was like, well, what is the game? Like, we want to talk about that. I mentioned the set collection mechanic. And once we, you know, had an internal kind of prototype, you know, it was really, we felt like, hey, there's something here. I mean, you know, coming out of casual games, like my mantra in a lot of studios I worked with was easy to learn, easy to play, quick reward, which means we want to get people in. We don't want the overhead of a complicated rule set, and we want it to be engaging and fun and reward the player pretty quickly into the game. So it had all that stuff, and that, you know, so it had the passion part, the mechanics seemed to speak to, you know, how we want to do, and then, you know, again, being a producer, we always, you know, talked about unique selling points and things like this, and the green light process of what games to move forward and whatnot. And honestly, the process wasn't a lot different here. So we looked at, like, does this game have any hooks? And we thought, well, the Chinese language angle is great because we illustrate these characters and the words with the foods. We also, you know, from a visual design standpoint, it was like, oh, well, you know, take out imagery. Like I could really see that. I think it'd be fun. I think there's a lot of areas to play with. I think it'd be a good hook. I think it'd be a good selling point for the game. So once we had all those points, it's like, oh, well, this seems like it has legs. So there's a passion, and then it seems like, hey, there's some potential here. And, you know, it really kind of fit in as well with, you know, we wanted to take these experiences we were passionate about and try and translate them to games. So this fit, it checked all the boxes, and we were like, great, this seems like a good thing to invest in. It also seemed like it was a manageable scale. This would only be our second tabletop project. Our first tabletop project was a licensed game that was part of a larger kind of promotion for a superhero action figure that year. It was available online, and, you know, we felt like we wanted to build on some successes we had there, but actually go to retail and figure out how we could move these copies like in the physical space. So the fact it wasn't, you know, this huge box and 300 pieces and everything, we'd have to like, okay, we can produce a deck of cards. We know how to do that.
Yeah, so on our side, House Sorcery, when the project started, it was a 4-week class prototype at Northeastern called Buzzbreakers. That's a screenshot from Buzzbreakers. That's pretty photorealistic. And we had 4 developers, and an important thing here in terms of our constraints was like kind of the way the groups formed is we didn't really have any art talent to speak of on our team, and what that really meant for us was we had the opportunity to focus on what the core mechanics of the game were and just implementing that, and we didn't get, I don't want to say distracted, but we knew having an option where like, oh, we're going to present this prototype that looks like, you know, a vertical slice of a game. Like, that just was never in the cards, right? So we just didn't worry about that. Instead, worried on what is the thing we want to explore and how do we get there. What was like kind of the motivation behind the mechanics? So at the time, this prototype happened in October of 2013, and there was, I mean, local multiplayer obviously existed, but it hadn't really flourished in the way it has in the past few years. A lot of indie games were like pixel platformers, and so I think everyone remembers that time. And so that was something that was interesting to us, where it's like, hey, I think there's an opportunity here. People like these experiences and are nostalgic for them. And we also wanted to like explore this mashup of taking arcade, like simple arcade experiences, and also really organic, real-world experiences like things like volleyball. Like we looked at a lot of like sports, and so like how can we merge those mechanics in a digital space and do something kind of interesting. So that was kind of the creative heart of the game and what we tried to explore in that initial prototype. So I think the main takeaway for this first phase is find the core passion and get there as directly as possible. So if you're kind of in this part and you're like, oh, I have this idea, but oh, what about all these features and all this art and stuff? It's like, don't worry about that. What success looks like at the end of phase one is you found some really rough, gross prototype that explores the thing that you want your game to be about. If you're thinking about your game and you can't find a way to do that, there's a decent chance you're thinking too big for this project, at least initially. So I would recommend trying to scope down and focus on what is some core experience you want to explore. Find a way to prototype that either digitally, either with paper and pen. There's all different kinds of ways to do that. But just get there kind of as directly as possible.
I mean, it's not really about limiting, but I mean, there's all the time after it to kind of have it grow. I think having like a strong, like you'd put it, I think you'd call it like a nugget, or just like, hey, we need kind of that small thing to kind of build from, and that's kind of key.
Cool. So at this point, if you're moving into phase two, the idea here is that you have some proof of concept, some prototype that you feel strongly about, and feel like it represents this thing that you want to explore, right? It's not perfect, like we said, it's rough, but you have something that you can build off of. And that's kind of the prerequisite for this part of development.
So, once we had, and we had basically your sort of index card prototype, we had sort of played that ourselves and validated ourselves and felt like, hey, it was there, and really kind of building that out, was that next step. And in a lot of ways, as far as, again, Meg and I having come from digital games, like this was a part of the process in a lot of ways we were comfortable with, or at least we understood. Like we understood prototyping and play testing. That had always been part of our process. I mean, it was the newer parts of that we're figuring out, like Boston Indies is great. They had several events where you could come in and sort of play a prototype your game, and that was instrumental to kind of growing and developing and getting that feedback. Kamikaze in Somerville, so game and comic store, was super supportive, really instrumental, and kind of giving us space at game nights to kind of try some things out. And really that leading to iterative development, which again we were comfortable on. Once we get that feedback and get see players actually sort of interact with it, we then could like pivot, we could grow, we could cut things. I mean, one thing as far as takeout that really happened during this phase I recall is we always had the idea of action cards, to move along the gameplay, make it competitive. But it was really that balance of how many of these things like exist and what made it fun, what kind of moved it along in sort of the play time that we were hoping to hit. So, all that was kind of critical in this. The parts of it that were challenging to us, like, when we were in this phase or trying to build this, is we really hadn't dealt with like just physical objects like this before. I mean, it had always been, for us, like digital games releasing, whether it's on game portals or however we kind of, that stuff went out. And this is another instance where it was like we leaned really heavily on our network, most of which were video games, but new, folks that maybe had released a card game or had worked on other sort of collectible card games, and really kind of exploring that network, getting advice, getting feedback, and also frankly just putting us in touch with printers, like so we could actually figure out how to cost this thing out, how to actually make it a reality. So all this kind of like was during the stage, and it was also learning for us, again, as far as the physicality of it, like adjusting our timeline, our thinking as far as like getting proofs back and things like that. Like there was just a lot of sort of just frankly shipping and mail and all that, and sort of beginning to adjust our timeline and our expectations and expectations of people who, we were working with or trying to get interested in the game, so that, that sort of became part of our process, our cadence.
So on Sorcery's end, so it's a lot of what Harold talked about. We're like fleshing out the game. We have this prototype, and so naturally you're going to start adding features. You're play testing. You're iterating. You're like, oh, we need a menu. So you add things like that to your game, and in doing so, what ends up happening is like a lot of cracks in your development process and your team start to show. And so that's what's really important about this phase, is pushing kind of outwards from your prototype, finding where your limits are and adjusting accordingly. So one of the things we came up with originally was like, when Adam and I decided to take over the project after that class prototype, it was just us. And I won't speak for Adam. I certainly know that I had this romantic notion of being the next Vlambeer, just this like duo of dudes who eat ramen and crank out hits. It's really hard, it turns out. And I think for a while I was a little resistant to like adding people to the team, because I was like, no, we can just do it all. We can be heroes. And that's dumb. The game is a million times better with every person we add to the team. So as of right now, the team is 7 people in total. And that's just over years of figuring out, again, where our limitations were as a group and adjusting accordingly and talking to the right people and recruiting for people who are good at their job and know how to contribute to the project. Where do you find time for this? I know Harold and I are both in a situation where we are doing this on the side. We're not full-time indie, we're part-time indie. And so time is always a challenge. For me, I think the 2 things to look at are tracking your time, so you can actually get a sense of how much work you're doing. It's easy to be like, man, I worked so hard this week on the game, and then if you actually track, you're like, I did like 45 minutes. It was just a painful 45 minutes. So that's going to give you a realistic sense of like, how much effort are you actually putting in? And the other thing is to keep trying schedule until you get it right. I was like losing my mind trying to find a schedule that worked for me, where I could feel like I was being productive on my game and at work and had a healthy balance for everything. I tried everything. I eventually found like a schedule that worked for me and a cadence that worked for me, and that had like enormous returns. It increased my time spent in the game by like 3x. I was way more engaged in the project because of it, and it just added a ton of value to the production overall. So it can be a little demoralizing to struggle to find that time, but I just think if you keep experimenting with different ways of contributing to the project, you're going to find one that works for you and that you can do reliably. And that's really important if you want your project to live on. And then lastly, how do you make more than a prototype? If you're coming from the context a lot of the team was coming from, at school, we had the space to create prototypes, but we didn't often get a chance to move much past that. So a lot of this was kind of fog of war for us. Presenting at showcases and events is really important. One, because you want to get it as polished as you can to show people, so it's a good motivator. Also, if there are things wrong with your game, kind strangers will remind you. So that's good, and it's a good reality check to have. And you also want to keep a backlog and just track everything. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. If you want to do a Word doc, you could do that. There are better tools probably, but it's whatever is just going to help you keep track of things you want to be doing, keep track of things that you can't do right now or later. That's going to give you a sense of scope for the project, and it's also just going to be a way to not lose things kind of between the cracks as you work on other things.
I mean, this is probably my tendency, being a producer and coming to it, but I really think that idea, whether it is an actual backlog or a Trello board or what have you, to me the translation, because whether it's was in the game industry we worked before or now, even when we're just hey, here's a concept, is there something to this? The step to me where it always becomes real is where you build out that backlog or you start to build out that scope, because I think it's really kind of theoretical. It's very much in your head, but I think, you know, that step of like, hey, I'm going to scope this. I'm going to literally write out everything that has to happen to make this reality is a really key. To me, it's always a big turning point because at that point it's real.
Yeah, so for phase 2, I think the big takeaway is, you know, as we talked about, pushing your prototype, working on it, and trying to explore all facets of it, and that's going to expose to you what your unknowns are, what you need to do to overcome them, and, you know, who you need to work with to figure that out. Success at the end of phase 2 really looks like, hey, we have a team that can tackle, you know, any reasonable challenge that's coming in the pipeline. We can make consistent progress, and at that point, it's kind of just, hey, like, where do we want to be taking this project because we can handle it.
I mean, the team part, not to I mean, it's also like coming, like your whole thing about adding to the team. I mean, that was like, so Meg and I have defined roles, but it's really sort of understanding like, hey, do we have all the skills to take? You know, I mean, there's, like you said, kind of casting off this idea of like a garage genius, or I can do all this, but really kind of taking some honest evaluation of where you're at and where your team's at, and like, hey, do we have all those skill sets, and being very honest and earnest about going out at that point if you're not, and kind of building that network or building that support.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, the two options whenever you hit one of these development breaking points are we either need to bring someone onto the team or we need to find a way to learn the skills that we need to learn. And both are completely valid. It's just a matter of what you think you can reasonably do and making sure you find a solution to that problem. Because until you do, you're not really going to be able to work at the cadence you need to work at.
Okay, so phase 3, defining project limits, and we'll kind of go in that. I mean, it's the whole time you're growing your game, but at the same time, sort of recognizing certain realities that sort of, in some ways, it helps define your game. It helps like sort of set how your game's going to grow and sort of the areas, you know, in which your game can grow. So in the case of Takeout, you know, our main sort of where our, I guess, limit or, you know, came in was $18. And what $18 was a lot of research looking at games that were, you know, that we felt like, you know, that we're not a clone of, but we felt like, hey, this has a feeling, it has kind of the audience, it has everything else we want. And what we came to is $18. Takeouts, retails for $18. So that seemed to be a point that once we had the creative dialed in, it really helped us on the production side. Like we knew we wanted that target. We could go higher a bit, but we really felt strongly like $18 is where we want to go. So what that did, once we had that, we then had a point to begin talking to printers and getting like those sort of estimates. We then sort of understood, you know, going to distributors or retailers, what that would look like wholesale for us. Like what was the threshold? Because like we love this project, but at the same time, like we really wanted to bring this to market. So what was that threshold where we could still make money? I mean, I'm not talking about breaking even, but make money on this. And you know, still have a viable thing. And it really did frame, especially like when we started talking to printers, it framed all that stuff for us, and it really kind of opened our eyes to materials, printing, and just how we kind of perceived that way. So just a couple points on the slide, and I mentioned the research, and I think that's critical, and I think we'll talk about more about that in this phase, in phase 4. You know, the cost per unit, and you know, just more research, really talking to printers, doing the due diligence, looking at proofs, speaking to past customers, looking at their case studies, verifying that information, and making sure they can actually do what they say they're going to do. Making sure that they're going to do what they say they're going to do at a quality that's acceptable to you. And that you know, all that stuff was a learning curve, and all that stuff, things that we had to really, you know, take on. But really that $18 point is what helped define all that sort of work.
Yeah, on our end, I'm going to reiterate the research. So it's important to look at, you know, understanding what you want your market to be, who are the kind of players you want to experience this? What are games in a similar genre or similar space doing? What's their price point? What features do they have? What features don't they have? What things can you get away with, right? Just being realistic about your competitors and what you want your ideal experience to be. That's really important in helping define what's important to your game. Understand your team's pace and costs. So if you've been tracking time on the project, if you are working on it regularly with your team, you have a good sense of, hey, how much work can we get done in a week? How much work can we get done in a month? How much work can we get done in 6 months? Use that to kind of plot out what can we realistically get done. Is it important to us that we ship this year? Are we going to be comfortable working on this game for 2 years, 3 years? What kind of return do we want here? And if you ever kind of get lost in the mix where, hey, we have this team and we can tackle any challenge and we can add whatever features we want, that can almost be a little too daunting because all of a sudden you're all powerful. And that's going to sometimes turn you around. So think about what the core of your project is at the end of the day. That's going to help guide you in terms of what takes priority and what's worth your effort. Because realistically, you don't have infinite time, so you got to make it count. I also think it's important to kind of make peace with the thing that you're making. Harold and I talked a lot about this, but you know, at the end of the day, what you're making is going to be interesting and valuable if you're playtesting with people and they like it. It's also not going to be perfect. There's going to be games out there that are doing things similar to your game. There are going to be games out there who have a feature you don't have, or they do something better, or you know, they have better XYZ, right? All these things are just constantly going to be true, and that's not a fault of your game. Your game is its own thing, and so just kind of make peace with that. Because if you're constantly stuck in like this rat race of like, oh, we got to have this feature because this other game has it, you're just going to be chasing them down, and that's not going to help you get to ship, and which is really the goal here, especially at this stage in your studio's growth. Stop pushing for visual overhauls, Eric, you idiot. So if you notice the past couple pictures, the game has changed a lot visually. I gave a talk about this 2 years ago, but basically the game started as Buzzbreakers, became Crater Kings, and is now Scourgery. That was a long process, and a lot of that came from kind of visual direction and what we could support with our team members. So I felt like it was important to call that out because it definitely impacted our concept of limits and like what we thought we needed to achieve to make the game successful. It was the right move. The game, we're really happy with like the aesthetic of the game now and how it looks and all those things. But it was definitely costly in terms of development.
So here are the big takeaway: using the team's trajectory to predict what your investment will look like and adjusting accordingly. Just being able to understand, to take like, I guess, what those limits are and turn that kind of into like a vehicle to both like adjust and pivot and sort of better the game. In terms of research, Eric and I were talking about this last time. We were preparing for this. Like one thing beyond kind of the price point that really struck home with us was a conversation we had at San Diego this past year with Diamond Distributors, and just the bit of advice beyond kind of like but going out and actually looking at retail spaces, whether it's Target or game stores and all that. How do they rack games? How do they sell games? So that that became a lot. That also was like a big factor in like helping us sort of define and like grow like what takeout could be.
Yeah, so really, again, phase 3 success looks like being able to define the scope of the project that you're working on.
Yeah.
You've assembled a dream team, you have the perfect process, this is all great, but you still have to put limits on yourself, not because you can't do more than that, but because it's not sensible to do more than that at a certain point. So just being realistic about how much investment you want to put into a single project.
And so phase 4 is actually shipping the game. Just ship it, right? Like at that point, you're all good. Just push it out. But yeah, so there's was a lot more obviously, to that. I mean, I think anyone who's ever worked on a creative project, whether it's the game or whatever that sort of endeavor is, like that last mile is always the hardest. Like that's the detail part. That's the part where it all has to come together. So it's a struggle, and it's kind of the worst. But I mean, understanding like that's kind of where, in a lot of ways, it sort of succeeds or fails. So for us, Takeout was part of FIG last year. That was like our big, we'd done play testing, but that's, we were in the tabletop showcase, and that's where people, outside of people we play tested with or whatever, like that's where that was it. That was kind of the first step in our actually shipping the game, making it a reality, and getting it out to folks. And beyond just like, I mean, the absolute stress of like, there was the first time we participated in that event, and I mean, I think any creative endeavor, it's hard to put yourself out there, especially if you're invested, in it, and sort of understanding how. So you have all that pressure, and then it's like, oh, okay, how are we going to demo this game? How are we going to interact with people in the booth? How do we want that experience to be? So it wasn't really just like. It wasn't really just like completing the game, but it was everything else around it to give it a chance to try and launch in a good way. After FIG, we kind of had a decision to make. We could have said, hey, we made a board game and it was in a thing and put it on a shelf, and that would be that, and then we could go do something else. But we really believed in the game and wanted to take it further. And it being our second kind of physical game, and not having a lot of reputation at space, like distributors were not at our door looking to buy crates of Takeout, not at all. So really what we decided to do was kind of try and build word of mouth, critical mass, good feelings around Takeout that we then could take to retailers and to distributors. So we started doing conventions, and we really sucked at it at first. We were really terrible in ways that, having not done it before, you can be terrible. Like, we didn't really, figure, like, hey, can we actually make money at this? So a lot of the earliest conventions were money. Like, it was great to see big signs with Takeout, right? But that cost us a bunch of money, and we didn't get any of that money back. The other thing was, I thought we'd had a successful launch at FIG, but it's a much different thing in a larger event to kind of like, how do we move people through the booth? How do we demo a card game? And that's a skill in and of itself. And if anything, I think I sort of arrogantly sort of proposed, like, oh, we'll put it out there and people will be interested and they'll come in, and like, that's not the case, and they won't. I can promise you they won't. So all that kind of went into us bringing the game to market. So now when we do conventions, I think it actually benefits the game, and it's helping us move forward to get further into retail. Like, we do cost analysis. Like, we basically do shows for 3 reasons. Like, one, like, this is an event that we know will have folks, like, we find a lot of times it's like couples or people that want to take like a game to the bar or to game night, or because our game also like has large Chinese characters and is color coded, like kids are really interested. So like families with kids can play it, and that seems like a big cross section. But we usually can get a feel for an event, like, hey, are we gonna find folks like that there because the game we find speaks to them. So if we can make money at the show, yeah, absolutely, we'll do it. That's great, right? The other thing we really look at is networking costs. I mentioned we went to San Diego. We were on a panel, this San Diego Comic-Con this past year, and we could not have sold enough copies of Takeout or our other game, frankly, to have paid for that trip remotely. But it was great because we sat down with publishers, we sat down with retailers, we sat down with distributors. There were just a lot of folks, like artists that we may work with on future. They're just like, it's these events where so many people are in the one place really made it worth the cost, because we built relationships we're still building on now. So we went from being spectacularly bad at this to, I think, we're getting better,
Yeah, so on our thing, on our side, I think it's really important to recognize that, as Harold said, that last stretch is hard. So to me, one of the biggest pieces of advice is just trust in the thing that you're making. If you're at this point in the process, you've play tested the thing, you're passionate about the thing, you have a team that cares about it, and you're playing with other people, and hopefully the feedback's good. At that point, trust your past self, trust those past experiences. They're all telling you that you're still good to go. It can be easy to start doubting yourself and being like, oh, well, like, what if we made this huge change late in development? Don't. It's not worth it. Trust in the thing, trust in the experience that's taken you this far already. It feels really good to take care of little things you've been pushing off for a while, and they can actually add a lot to the game. I know there's a handful of small, polishy things in Scorcery that we put in pretty late in development, and we got a ton of bang for our buck, and I'm really glad we put in that work. And it ended up being not as much work as I think we had feared it would be, so that was great. That said, don't underestimate how much time things outside of the development itself will take. This is marketing. In our case, we're releasing on PS4. There's a lot of work that is involved in getting it onto the platform successfully and working with Sony. So if those things are unknown to you, certainly don't write them off as just quick efforts. And prepare yourself to make cuts for anything that's not at the core of your experience. If your deadlines are slipping and you're putting a lot of time and effort into kind of things auxiliary to your experience, again, think about what the core of this project is, why you made a prototype in the first place, and if there are things getting in the way of that, you just gotta cut it. Because it's, at the end of the day, an imperfect shipped game is infinitely better than a perfect not shipped game. I think Tom Hanks said that. So that's just really important to keep in mind, and just be prepared to make those cuts when you need to. And honestly, it's kind of a bummer of a last bullet point, but it's just going to be a slog. There's no way around it. There's no silver bullet. At the end of the day, if you're at this phase, you've built a team that can successfully work, you have a vision, you know where you're scoped. That's all you need, and then you just need to put in the work. If you're not in a place where your team is kind of has a good development process, or there are still things you're figuring out in terms of your scope, you're honestly not really ready to be talking about releasing. And if you try to release too early while you're still figuring the other stuff out, it's going to be a mess. Releasing's hard enough as it is, so make sure before you get here you have that other stuff figured out, because that's the only thing at the end of the day that's going to allow you to actually ship.
I mean, so yeah, I think everyone knows this, and it's true. I mean, to me, being in that space, it's also important to remember, the victories on the other side of it. Sometimes when you're in that process of trying to get something out the door, I feel like that's an eternity space. My God, we're never going to get out of this. This is just where I live now. And I think keeping some ray of hope, no, there are good things on the other side of this. I don't know, it keeps me sane.
Yeah. Cool, so just to kind of recap what we're looking at here, phase one, build something quick and dirty, explore the experience you want to explore, and get there as quickly and directly as possible. Phase two, push the boundaries of that thing you made and find out where the weak points are, either in your skill set, in kind of what your team talent looks like, in the things you don't know, like distributors and printers and all those things. Use phase two to iterate on the game, play test, and find out what those weak points are. Phase three, now that you have a team that is built out and ready to roll, figure out what done actually looks like. Don't use this guy is the limit as your limit. That's dumb. You're never going to ship. Stop that. Really just figure out what you want success to look like and define it clearly. And then phase four, just trust yourself, trust your process, keep hammering away at it, and you're going to get there.
So post-release, and I want to make sure we have time for QA, so I'm gonna touch on a few points in the slide here, where we are with takeout, but sure. I'm gonna go through that a bit more rapidly just to make sure we have enough time for kind of questions. So so now the game's out in the world. At this point, I mentioned we started doing conventions to try and promote the game and get some visibility from it. we're part of online retailers. We got listed on Amazon, which was huge for us to kind of figure that out and go through, and you know, have certainly, despite Amazon's best efforts, we've done pretty well in that. Anyone that's ever sold through Amazon might understand that. But so from there, you mind hitting the slide? Oh, that's your slide.
Yeah. Groceries in a slightly different spot. We had originally targeted shipping on February 5th. So originally this talk was supposed to be me saying how we just shipped 4 days ago. We unfortunately had a delay. It's complicated. Anyways, but our development work is done. The game's gold. So we have kind of non-development work that we're going through right now. Again, shipping on console platforms introduces a lot of complexity. That's certainly something we're working with. And there's also a marketing and social media component that, you know, has been challenging. And we've recruited and invested on that end to try to improve kind of our reach. And so far that's been really good. This is a publication talking about how we got a delay, and that's not even someone I know personally, so it's been successful to reach out to people and get some traction, which is great. But that's certainly, you know, it's awesome if you release, and that's great, and you should absolutely celebrate. There's certainly work to be done in those late stages and post stages as well.
So, you know, I mentioned, you know, we're online, we're moving on. So now we're really working hard. You know, we're having discussions with distributors. I'll kind of touch on that as we go through the slide. But really, not having done this before, you know, we kind of did what seemed like the most obvious thing. I mean, frankly, we started going to retailers. Like our plan was, well, let's try and roll this out in retail regionally. Let's get some case studies for resellers. Let's see some success, see if we can get some buzz about it, some good feeling from retailers, and do that. And that, in a lot of ways, has been fantastic for us. I mean, where it's been good, and I mentioned on the slide, it's like a master class on how these guys, I mean, especially like dedicated game stores, like these folks know their customers, they know how to move product. I mean, it's been a phenomenal learning experience. I should mention one of our retail partners, the Book and Board in Winchester, Mass. Like, those guys hand sell this game. I probably learned more watching them sell copies of this game than I did in any other experience. The only downside to this is it's really, really time consuming, and it's a lot of legwork for, like, you know, just starting a new, basically wholesale account. And really they're gonna take, maybe you can kind of see the case, like one case a game, and that's great, and that's a victory for us with every time, but it's a disproportionate amount of work to kind of get to that order right now. And that goes to the next slide. And I watched this clip 7 times when I put this slide together. I love this clip. But, you know, coffees for closers. I don't know if we're exactly closing, but one takeaway is, you know, Meg being game design, myself, you know, doing the production stuff and visuals, like, we just don't have sales and marketing knowledge. And it kind of took us going through this entire process. We're now actively doing, not only just like, how do we better reach out to retailers? How do we kind of close some of these conversations that we've had with distributors? But frankly, like, how do we get the game in the hands of people that are going to put videos playing? You know, like how do we get just more good press, more good feelings about the game? And, you know, right now that's something we're working on because we've kind of identified like that's not our skill set. You know, and other things just, you know, and this is kind of a debate Meg and I are having. You know, the most consistent feedback we get on the game is people love the packaging, they love the idea, it looks like, you know, and part of me feels like, well, maybe we should have gone bigger. Like, in some ways, maybe we could have done a deluxe edition, maybe we could have gotten real takeout boxes. And we do get that feedback. And, you know, Meg is kind of on the other end of this, in that, you know, she likes the idea of the small game, it fits in with a lot of her vision. You know, she came from New York, we live, you know, in a small Somerville apartment, so we put a lot of value on those games that we can kind of store and don't eat up a lot of our lives. But, you know, this is the most interesting part where I've gotten the exact opposite feedback from distributors and retailers. Because every retailer we go to, like, they'll pick up the game, they're like, I love it, I love the price point, I can pick it up, I feel like the price point, I know I can sell it to a customer, and it is like garlic to a vampire to distributors. They're just like, why are you doing a small People like big boxes. They like a lot of pieces. So it's exact, and that's part of what we're navigating. It is the exact opposite feedback on those sides.
Cool. So that kind of wraps up the direct portion of our talk. Again, my name is Eric. I'm from GrappleHook Games. We've been working on Sorcery. I swear it's going to launch soon. Targeting Q1 2019. You can follow us at Team GrappleHook and at Sorcery on Twitter. That's where we're most active.
So we're Small Monsters Games, smallmonstersgames.com. I'm Harold. I'm really bad at that. So that's my name. But smallmonstersgames.com. You'll find links to purchase the games online. We do dev posts about upcoming titles. I mentioned Kamikaze and the Book and Board. Those are two. They've been super supportive. So if you actually want to go out today and buy it physically at retail, please support those guys. And follow us on Twitter at small_monsters. Thank you.
So thanks. So as we mentioned at the beginning, happy to do Q&A now. Yeah.
Your talk about making peace with your game.
Mm-hmm.
How much would you say it's worth it to first do research on what else is out there? Like if I'm going to make a zombie card game, I'm sure there's already zombie card games out there, and you don't want to reinvent the wheel. If you could make something great, but if someone else had literally the same mechanics, the same idea, how's that gonna work out for you? So how much effort do you think you should put into finding that out?
So I actually think it's good to do your research, especially if you are suspect that like the exact thing that you want to do is already out there. That said, there's so many games that share a lot of space in a Venn diagram, right? There's so many games that on paper look the same or visually look the same that consumers are going to bucket them as the same thing anyway, regardless of if they are or not. So do your research, find out, all right, how directly are we competing with these people, and kind of evaluate that against how badly you want to make the thing. If it's like your dream project, just make it anyways. You might be doing it better, and you can actually look at those other games and maybe see where they have gaps and improve upon them, and now you're just making a better thing. So I think, do the research, but don't necessarily let it stop you if you find that there's something else in the space. The entire time we've been working on Sorcery, we've known that it has similarities to Lethal League, if that's a game people are familiar with. Lethal League's awesome. There are things that, and again, it's a different game, but we're competing in that space, but we also know that like this is just something we care about and think is interesting and different. So we just went ahead and did it.
I agree 1,000%. I think being aware of the market is part of your responsibility. I think if you want to be part of that conversation, but I don't we're stocked almost every retail location we're in right now. We're stocked next to Sushi Go. I do not think that Takeout is Sushi Go. I think they are two very different games, but I get it. Visually they're similar. I think the sort of the target, some of the gameplay is similar. And, but I feel like at the end of the day, like you're saying, I feel like we brought something unique to our game that you're not going to get. I feel like they're very much two different games. And, I think it was something we thought about or were concerned about, but we believed in the game enough and felt it was different enough that we pursued it. And I feel like, we made a good decision.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a little bit more about Phase 4, because it seems like, especially if you have a passion for game design and development, Phase 1, 2, parts of 3 might come a little more naturally to your core skill set, and especially even as a team. But it seems, at least from my inexperienced perspective, once you get to Phase 4, there might be a quantum leap in the things you have to do, how to sell, how to market, how to distribute, that you just don't pick up, writing code and working on stuff. And I wanted to ask if there was anything that you did specifically before Phase 4 to prepare for that, or maybe anything you wish you did.
we were pretty good at reaching out. Like one of my sort of mentors from my previous life in games is a guy named Jay Powell, and he runs a game consulting group. He was with MERSCOM before they went to Plato, and a lot of game companies that way. Even though Jay is still in the video game space, like he's just done business development and marketing for games. And I kind of limited how much I would pick its brain because I thought, oh, it's a different space. It's not one-to-one. And I wish to God I actually, I wish I'd annoyed the hell out of Jay. I wish I'd have been on the phone every day with Jay. And when I do this again, as we bring other things, I will. Because beyond just kind of the wisdom he could get, like last week he put me in touch with someone that was at Wizards of the Coast before they went to Hasbro, through those. I mean, that was an amazing conversation. It wasn't even something that I think necessarily would translate one-to-one to where we're at scale-wise, but just to kind of have that knowledge and that download and to know, hey, that's somebody else I can reach out to with questions that would probably really understand where we're at. It's hard to do because I think you're so focused on what you're making, and I don't know, maybe it's just my personality type. It's really hard for me to feel like, hey, this isn't someone's thing. It's not their, I don't want to burden them with this. I don't want to completely bug them. I'm I'm over that now. Screw that. It's just it's pick up the phone.
Yeah, I think on my end, it's still a nut we're trying to crack a bit. Like I said, we're investing more resources. We're working with this really great PR guy who's helped us out a lot. We're trying to, like I said, just be more present on social media. That's honestly half the battle. It's just showing up on people's timelines and talking about stuff. Twitter's a horrible, toxic hellhole, but it actually has a really good indie game kind of dev scene. So if you're not on there, I would definitely recommend looking at it. I actually got a lot of inspiration out of seeing people hey, I made this crazy prototype, and it's cool to follow those creators and people making progress in their game. And so being a part of that scene is actually pretty compelling to me from what's otherwise a horrible mistake of a platform. But again, I think a lot of what we were doing in Phase 4 was just focusing on getting to the light at the end of the tunnel and wrapping that game up. So I think we still certainly have work to do in terms of how can we, be kind of marketing earlier on and building out that aspect of it, truthfully, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I already asked a question. You go first.
Well, this is kind of a peripheral question, I think, but I noticed one of your games was based on Captain Action.
Yeah.
Which is a really pretty obscure reference. I had one when I was 6, but even I knew it was kind of a knockoff of G.I. Joe. The question is, what value did you think that having what would really be, for most people, pretty obscure reference bring to that game?
That's a really good question, because it did bring some value, and I agree with you. Captain Action, and most people are probably scratching your head, and rightfully so. So Captain Action, just a little bit of context, was the first superhero action figure, and the reason he was the first superhero action figure is they weren't producing superhero action figures in 1966. So they came out with an action figure that was dressed as kind of a generic superhero, Captain Action, who you then could dress as other superheroes. So you dress him as Batman or you dress him as Spider-Man. So Captain Action in and of itself, just the sort of the hero base is its own IP. So the value of us, so to give a little context, our first game, we produced a card game, a retro card. There was a Captain Action card game in 1966. And a lot of the Captain Action brand now is appealing to these retro collectors, right? Doing recreations or things like that, that sort of these folks that collect this stuff really collect this stuff. So the value was, one, we had worked on licensed titles in the video game space, but we felt like this would be a good exercise in getting that experience, improving. We really wanted to make tabletop games, and I think our thinking at the time was if we launch with a branded title, even if it's maybe not a household name, that we felt like it would give us some credibility. And actually, I feel like that has. I feel like, honestly, Captain Action, believe it or not, has opened a lot more doors with distributors and things like that than Takeout has. Because, Takeout's our IP, no one's heard of that. like you said, I mean, I've met a lot of distributors who've had captain actions when they were 6, right? I mean, it's opened some doors for us for sure. It also helped us. So we were part of the 50th anniversary of the characters while we produced the game. We worked with the now owners of the IP to kind of get that license and to be part of that sort of year-long event. It gave us a deadline so we wouldn't flail around and sort of figure it out. Like we really had to learn on our feet how to produce a card game and how to make that available. You know, and it gave us a lot of, I mean, I didn't mention this, the thing, I wrote comic books for like Image and IDW from like 2008 to 2013. I don't really do a lot of it anymore. I'm a lot more focused on games. But it gave us like a lot of comic book artists, a lot of really talented artists drew those cards. And now we kind of have kind of that go-to sort of base if we need. I mean, you know, what I consider really heavy hitters like Jerry Ordway, folks that are kind of known in that industry. So does that answer your question? Like,
yeah,
I think,
no, I'm
yeah.
just curious what it was, what the value was. That's
Yeah. So I think it sort of came up that way. Like we still see kind of secondary value, I guess, kind of out of working with that brand.
Cool. So obviously we want to let people get to the next talk and help the next guys set up here. So thanks so much for stopping by, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. I'm starting to get into the answer section.
Just a real basic